Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next chapter in our series of aquaculture-related webinars designed to bring together science and business to expand and strengthen the United States aquaculture industry. These webinars are a joint effort between the National Aquaculture Association, the North Central Regional Aquaculture Center, and the United States Aquaculture Society. Whether you're currently engaged in aquaculture, looking to get into business, an educator helping others understand aquaculture, or just want to become a better educated consumer, we hope that these webinars will enhance your knowledge and move you forward on your journey to success. Today's webinar is entitled Fish Health, What You Need to Know as an Aquaculture Producer, and will be presented by Dr. Nick Phelps, an assistant professor in the Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology Department at the University of Minnesota, and also co-director of the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center. Nick earned his bachelor's degree from Bemidji State University in aquatic biology, a master's degree from the University of Arkansas Pine Bluff in aquaculture, and a doctorate degree from the University of Minnesota in veterinary medicine. Nick developed and led the aquatic diagnostic service at the Minnesota Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory for 9 years prior to his recent move to a research-focused position. Broadly, his research aims to support health and sustainability of farmed and wild fish populations. Specific areas of interest include pathogen discovery, diagnostic development, fish kills, and aquaculture and aquaponics production. And don't forget to tune in at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on January 18th when Dr. Andrew Ray will discuss indoor shrimp farming. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Nick.
All right, thank you, Alan, and thank you everybody for tuning in today. Also, thanks to the webinar sponsors, the National Aquaculture Association, the North Central Regional Aquaculture Center, and the U.S. Aquaculture Society. All right, so as Alan mentioned, today's topic is on fish health. And this could be a webinar series all to its own. There are many topics that we can go into. What I'm going to try to focus on today is what you as producers may want to think about. What I'm going to assume that you already know is sorry about that. I'm going to assume that you already know how to raise fish and what normal fish look like. That's an assumption I'm making up front, and I'm going to just go through that very quickly. What we're going to talk about today, though, are the basic fish health considerations for aquaculture and the purpose and process of fish health inspection. After about 10 years in a diagnostic lab, looking at many thousands of fish and fielding hundreds of phone calls, there are some themes that kept coming up over and over again, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. The talk is going to be split between those two categories. Perhaps the first section there, basic fish health considerations, may be more relevant to new producers, whereas the fish health inspections are for maybe the more established, more bigger producers. What we're not going to talk about today are specifics related to disease and diagnostics. That could go on, and I didn't want to focus on any particular species or region, so we're going to skip that. And also avoid phone calls, but especially in online webinar, recommendations for treatments of various diseases, because each scenario is different and there's a lot of complexity there. First and foremost, though, we can all agree, if you don't know already, as an aquaculture producer or involved with this industry in some way, fish are going to die. That's an inevitable part of production. So we'll just accept that fact. What we can do, though, is find ways to prevent that from happening, or at least reducing the risk. And first and foremost is minimizing stress. The vast majority of chronic disease and outbreak events can be linked to some stressful situation for the fish, whether it be environmental conditions, poor feed, handling. Many things can stress the fish, and I'm not going to go into the details there. This is part of that assumption I made where you know how to raise fish. and minimize stress. But always, always keep that in mind as one of the #1 priorities in fish production. It could be an obvious thing to say that healthy fish into your production facility will likely mean healthy fish out. But over and over again, I talk to people who skip that step and bring fish onto their facility that have an unknown disease history and they haven't gone through quarantine, and they eventually get an outbreak. So just keep that in mind as well. Biosecurity, huge topic, hugely important, and I'm glad that there was another webinar in this series focused on biosecurity, so we'll skip that topic for today. It's also really important when thinking about fish health or production in general to just know your fish. And that seems obvious too, but there are a lot of people that don't, that focus on other aspects of production, and becoming familiar with your fish, the species, the system is really, really important. Get your hands dirty and become very familiar with what normal is. If you do see disease, if you have an outbreak or chronic mortality or sick fish, control disease early. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. And lastly, something to keep in mind to help keep your fish alive is routine fish health exam and inspections. This isn't just regulatory stuff, which most people will tend to think. These are voluntary as well as regulatory reasons to look at your fish health. First part here, we'll talk about fish health exams. Every other animal, and we can include plants in that scenario too, look at health exams. The health of the animals are vital to production success for many different reasons. And it's clearly should be a part of your on-farm best management practice. It should be a part of your best management plan that focuses on fish health. It needs to be not only considered in your plan and your daily operations, but you should include it as well in your operating budget. Fish health costs money. There's going to be supplies, there's time, there's service fees. And if you plan for that up front when thinking through your business model and your day-to-day operations, you'll be much better off in the long run. Along those same lines, I would highly suggest you develop a relationship with a veterinarian or other fish health professional. Those people should be familiar with your farm and with your fish. If you call them when things are bad, it's a reactionary process at that point, and you'll have you'll be less likely to have a positive outcome than if you had a relationship up front. Now, there are many things though that you can do without a fish health professional, and there are DIY, do-it-yourself fish health exams that I would highly suggest you do, and you can consult a veterinarian to do this for you, or you can do some of these basics yourself. I would highly suggest for the healthier fish to do a routine exam at least every 3 months, but preferably every month. Just take a subset of your fish and look at them. Look for symptoms of stress, if they have reduced appetite or feed conversion, if the growth rates have slowed down, if you see an increase in opportunistic parasites or bacteria, fungal infections starting to happen. If you can catch those signs of stress early, you can start to mitigate and have a much better response. I'd suggest that you collect and analyze your data over time, and I'll show you on the next couple slides the types of data I'm talking about. But if you want to look back and see where things went wrong or understand normal, you need to collect the data. There's a lot of very experienced, seasoned producers that just have this intuition. They understand their fish and their production. You can tell when something's amiss. But for new producers, or even those that have been around for a while, collecting data and looking back at it can really improve your production efficiency over time. It'll also be really helpful for a diagnosis looking back at some of that data. If somebody calls me and says, I have this problem, I'll ask them when it started. And if they don't have it written down, it comes down to memory, and that can sometimes fail. So if you can keep data, again, that's really, really important. I'd also suggest that anytime you get sick or dead fish that show up on your pond and your tank, take a look at them. Often the people just throw them into the compost pile, but those early mortalities can be the sign of a much bigger outbreak to come. If you can get it quick, you have a much better chance at treating the problem early. I'd also suggest for these proactive, voluntary fish health exams to do an annual exam. Send fish to the diagnostic lab for the non-regulatory pathogens, or even the regulatory ones too if you're not required to do it. Some of the high-profile diseases you should monitor. Many fish diseases are linked to environmental stressors or triggers like water temperature. So you may have the introduction of a disease and it's not yet presented itself. But if you can find that early, you can start to do some management at your facility. The picture there, the inserted picture, is of a healthy spleen of a tilapia, and the other picture, the bigger picture, is a bad case of a Francisella infection. Now, Francisella will present itself here in the internal organs before you see external lesions. And this is a real bad disease tilapia producers are beginning to, unfortunately, become familiar with. If producers look for things like this, the fish gets sick, it dies without presenting external lesions, they could find a disease like this earlier than they would have otherwise. So again, become familiar with your fish, look at them, and do it regularly. The types of data to collect will vary depending on your production goals and your species and your system. But some of the standard metrics to keep track of for each lot or pond or tank, however you divide up your facility, the age, weight, length, the fat content, the feed conversion over the previous time period, are all really important trends to monitor. Looking at internal and external observations and any diagnostic findings associated with that over time are also really important. And again, let's say you're raising catfish that are maybe some off flavor or meat quality that you're monitoring. If it's walleye for stock enhancement, you may be looking at number of fish per acre. There could be different types of production goals that you want to monitor, and depending on your facility, you'll want to develop spreadsheets that can keep track of this. I'd encourage you, the producers on here, to be in touch and collaborate with your local extension specialists to help identify some of these metrics that are important for your type of production facility, and ask them to help review those data over time. Here's just an example of how you could use some of this. Let's say you're keeping track of the body condition for your fish. For months, it's going along, everything looks normal, but over time, this blue line, we'll call it pond 2, starts to trend downward. And suddenly, by the end of the 24 months and you're ready to harvest, you have a body condition score of about 3. That crept up on you, and even the seasoned producer may miss that. When you go to harvest, you're going to have a much lower value for those fish than you did in pond 1. You can go back in time and look at that data and find that there at week 16, something happened to deviate those 2 ponds. And you could, if you had been keeping track of other data as well, you can maybe link that to a change in feed, or environmental stress, or new fish were added and there was a chronic disease. There could be a number of things that cause this type of outcome, but it isn't common. But if you don't keep track of the information, you'll have nothing to go back to and look at. And all you'll have is that one time point at 24 months where 2 ponds are very different. And when you try to do it again next year, you'll have no basis for improvement. So let's take a look at an actual fish. And doing an actual health exam, looking at the fish, is something you can do at your facility. You don't necessarily have to send your fish into the lab to just do the basic diagnostics anyways. So we have our little goldfish here. Looks all happy and healthy. Maybe a little frayed fin, but otherwise doing just fine. You can make your notes during this health exam. Externally, the fish appeared normal. The next thing to do will be to take a little clip of the fin, scrape some mucus off of the skin, and do a little gill biopsy and look at them under the microscope. Just these little bits here that you see on this glass slide, you put 1 drop of water and some glass cover slips, and look at it under a compound microscope. And that's simple to do, and there are books that can give you ideas of what you might see, but you can find things like this. And whether it's in response to chronic illness or just one of the routine exam, you may come across parasitic, fungal, bacteria, pathogens that are on your fish. And most of the time you won't see anything, or perhaps you'll see just a few, and that's not any reason to be alarmed. But if you see a lot, it gives you an opportunity to do intervention right away. You don't have to send the fish off to a lab, wait several days for them to come back with a result, and then start treatment. You can do it much quicker if you have the ability and routine process already in place at your facility. So then you start looking, once you've looked at the outside of the fish, look internally. And here everything seems to look normal, and we can note that in our logbook. However, if you had opened it up, and although it looked normal on the outside, you see inside there's petechial hemorrhage in the visceral fat, and the liver looks mottled, you know something is amiss. And perhaps with experience, you can link this type of clinical lesion to a disease. But if not, you can call a fish health professional, call the veterinarian, and get these fish to the lab for proper diagnosis. Because something like this internally could be diagnosed as a serious problem that should be addressed quickly before you lose many of your fish. Let's assume that wasn't the case. You just continue to pick away, do a necropsy, pull the organs out, just be familiar with what normal looks like and look for abnormal observations. And if you can describe that in your logbook, and if need be, call a fish health professional, this will save you time, money, and hopefully the life and health of your fish. So that's just some of the basics things that a producer can do at their facility as far as disease diagnostics and fish health exams. But after 10 years in the diagnostic lab, the vast majority of the questions that I received were related with some version of this type of question. That I need to move fish from or to my farm, and I need a regulatory inspection. What do I need to do? So I want to spend a few minutes here, and I'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end, talking about regulatory inspections, because this is a ever-evolving part of aquaculture production and something that all producers need to be aware of. Regulatory health inspections are meant to protect the farm and wild animals, as well as human populations. And this isn't unique to fish. There's been a lot of stress in recent years in the aquaculture industry for doing regulatory inspections, but this is a common practice in all production systems. The swine, poultry, cattle, plants, they all test for disease, especially when things move between state lines, but also when things move within state boundaries. Just part of the production process. Specifically for fish health inspections, the purpose oftentimes is to demonstrate that the fish are free of certain pathogens. And I'll come back to what I mean by certain pathogens later, but it isn't all pathogens. This applies to pretty much all producers in the United States that are moving live fish since the VHS, sorry, that's a typo there, VHS era. So after 2006, when new regulations were put in place, there are dozens of species that these requirements apply to. For a long time, salmonid production was needing to do regulatory inspections. Then it became the 8 Great Lakes states and 35 more species, and other states are starting to adopt new rules as well. Because the reality is, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, aquaculture is not a zero-risk activity. We produce live animals and move them from one place to another, and there is inherent risk in that from a disease management perspective. And the policies are in place, again, to protect the wild and farm-raised populations. There are many challenges that have been become very apparent in recent years. The regulations between states are highly variable, and not just between states, but between sectors of aquaculture can be highly variable. And the rules can change frequently as new science is developed or concerns are raised, new laws are written. For better or worse, they change quickly. Communication about these rule changes and justification for why the regulatory policies are in place, I think, is limited. I think there's a lot of improvement that can be done there between, the arrow goes both directions, between regulators and industry. Communication is really important. Regulatory inspections can be costly and logistically challenging. I think this is beginning to be alleviated a little bit with more diagnostic labs coming online and increased capacity and just experience doing this. But regardless, the cost is still there, and this is a new cost for many producers to bear. The process can be confusing and unclear of who collects the fish, where they go, what kind of results do you need, and the permits that are required are an evolving thing, as I've mentioned. I don't think any of these challenges, though, cannot be overcome. And I think we've gone a long ways in recent years to address them. And some of the solutions that we're working on is just a better understanding of the process, both producers understanding the regulatory process and why these policies are in place, but also from the regulatory side, as they have had to build capacity internally with these management agencies and develop rules. It's important they understand aquaculture practices so they can build policies that benefit, that meet their management objective while not imposing overly burdensome rules on an industry. I think another solution is also just building relationships with regulatory agencies. And that's from, again, both directions. The producers and regulators cross-talking is really important and I think helpful in understanding and working towards these solutions. So I thought, as it relates to better understanding the process, I assume most of the people on this webinar are producers. So I thought I'd give you some of the frequently asked questions that I get at the diagnostic lab as it relates to fish health inspections. We kind of go through these as, and give some behind the scenes or why these things are the way they are. And perhaps that'll make it easier to understand or work with the process. So we'll go through who makes the rules. Very briefly, we'll go through these. Who makes the rules, who collects the fish, who does the test, what tests are to be used, the difference between a lot and the farm level inspection, and what pathogens are we supposed to be looking for. Now, I've tried to be very general with the following slides, but I will make the caveat up front that these are as of today, and rules change quickly and can be highly variable between states and jurisdictions, so there may be some exceptions to what I say. And I will advise you to, I'll show you on these slides coming up, to consult the regulatory agencies for specific details. But this will be a broad overview of the process. So first of all, who makes the rules? Where are all these policies coming from? And oftentimes it's with the receiving authority is going to make the rules on importation of fish. So here in Minnesota, it's our Department of Natural Resource sets policy on what can be imported into the state or around the state. There's also additional client requests. Although the farm may be here in Minnesota and the DNR has a certain set of standards, the client may want additional tests to be done. That's at their prerogative, and you as the supplier will need to comply with those if you wanted that business. At a federal level, it's most often the USDA APHIS who's making fish health rules. I would suggest that whenever you're going to be sending fish, I would consult that receiving state's competent authority. And I gave the example of Minnesota where it's the DNR. That's not necessarily always the case. It could be Department of Agriculture or Board of Animal Health or some combination thereof. But there is somebody in that state that's going to be permitting the fish health transportation permits. Talk to them on a regular basis. As I've said, things change at least annually, but it does not hurt to check in with them if you know that there's some issues brewing that may change some expectation. I've seen on multiple occasions where producers have relied on their clients to consult with the regulatory agencies, or they're just relied on last year's requirements and have got themselves in trouble. Not intentionally, they weren't trying to circumvent any rule, had the best intention, but just put the burden on somebody else. Ultimately, it's going to be your responsibility as a producer to do what you need to do. So I would put this on your list of things to check off when sending fish between states. There's a website there that is focused on the NICRAC. But there are other types of websites around in state agencies that have other information on importation regulations. So who collects the fish? They're often referred to as fish health collectors. Sorry, I keep getting little beeps here. And it could be a variety of people who are, a variety of people could be recognized to do your fish health collection. At the top of the list probably are accredited veterinarians. They would be acceptable for all domestic and international fish health inspections. But I would, you should double check. There are a few states that require additional training specifically in fish health for those veterinarians. Minnesota being one of those examples where the veterinarian has to have additional training, although they may be already accredited. The next tier probably are fish health inspectors or fish pathologists certified by the American Fisheries Society. They should be acceptable for all domestic fish health inspections, but they may not qualify unless given special consideration for international work. So if you're exporting out of the country, you may want to defer all of your inspection work to an accredited vet. And third on the list, there could be a variety of other types of people recognized by state agencies to do fish health work. This could include a DNR biologist, for example, or other type of field biologists who are out there. They get some training to do fish health collections, but they're not necessarily an expert in fish health. That may qualify for some states, but not all states, and very likely would not qualify for export testing. So if you're doing local work or local inspections, you could use a biologist, but double check that they would be acceptable to wherever you're sending your fish. Trying to find somebody, I hope that this issue has been alleviated a little bit. There's been a lot of training that's been done within states and some bigger programs to try to build the capacity for fish health collectors. But if you're having trouble finding somebody to come to your farm, try to talk to the local diagnostic lab. It's probably the best place to check because they'll know who is submitting samples for farmers near you. And you can also find information at on the NICRAC websites for the Great Lakes and surrounding states. You can also, of course, talk to your aquaculture association or other local producers and who they have come to their facility. So who does the test? And this is, there's been some confusion on this in the past, and there's a variety of types of people who can do testing for regulatory work on fish. There's government labs, state labs, there's federal labs, there's private labs, there's quite a few university diagnostic labs that offer service for the aquaculture industry. So you have a lot of options out there, I think, and I don't think that right now there is any limitation on access to laboratory capacity. I think that has been, that problem has been solved. The USDA APHIS does certify labs for testing, but the primary purpose there is for export testing. Although as producers, you can look at that list and see labs that have been inspected, and you will have confidence that the work they're doing meets very high and approved standards. All labs, for regulatory purposes, should be following the same protocols, but the quality control within those labs can be highly variable. Likewise, the prices in customer service between labs can vary quite a bit. So I would encourage you as aquaculture producers, now that there is quite a bit of lab capacity, I wouldn't hesitate to shop around. If you're going to ship the fish 50 miles, it's very possible to ship them 500 miles. So look around for the best value, both from a cost, quality, and customer service standpoint. When you're sending fish to the lab, and I'll just put a plug for many years of frustration on receiving fish, please call to confirm availability, that the lab has the capacity to test your fish if they're ready for them. It takes time to set up diagnostic testing, and having a heads up is really helpful. The fish should typically be freshly dead on frozen gel packs. It's important the fish get there within about 24 hours of being euthanized, so they do need to get to the lab quickly and should be sent overnight. Fill out the paperwork if your paperwork is not, it seems obvious, but a large percentage do not fill out paperwork, and that just delays the process and could result in you having to get a new collection and send more fish in. And please always check with the receiving authority for specific forms that they may have as it relates to fish health inspections. New York, for example, has a special form that needs to be filled out. And if you send that along with the fish, you can save yourself time in the long run. The tests that are to be used, ultimately the receiving state will make the final decision, but there are two main diagnostic guidelines that are fairly widely used. One is the Blue Book, commonly referred to as the Blue Book, by the Fish Health Section, the Fish and Wildlife Service. There's also international standard by the OIE. And some states allow both, some states have one or the other. They both are high quality, and I don't have a preference for one or the other. But just be aware when you're sending fish to a state to check and see which one they request. Always plan for a long turnaround time if you're sending fish in for regulatory testing. For the Blue Book standards, it can take 4 weeks plus a little bit to get your results back for viruses. The OIE can be a little faster, but it's still several weeks. And if you're behind, and oftentimes producers are very busy, and you should be thinking ahead when it comes to your regulatory testing. Bacteria, parasites, and PCR, and the molecular tests can be faster, but it still takes time. And you should look at these are just laboratory times. This does not account for shipping and report preparation. So again, plan ahead and expect it to take a little while to get results back. Now, there's a lot of confusion between lots and farm type inspections. I'll give you a very general overview, but I will put the caveat that there is some gray area between them and up to some interpretation. Lot inspections are typically certifying individual lots or groups of fish, and this is defined as the same species, age, or water supply. Basically, what they're looking for is that there's equal exposure and susceptibility within that population to a pathogen. So you're going to want to randomly select fish from that one lot, so that one group. Oftentimes, the numbers to be tested are 60 fish, and we're assuming a pathogen prevalence level of 5%. So you assume that you have this population of fish, and 5% of them are infected with the disease. 60 is the number you sample to find it. And you'll see how that's different in a farm inspection next. Typically, this is an annual inspection. Conversely, a farm inspection, or sometimes referred to as a facility inspection, you may have multiple species, ages, ponds, raceways, all within one facility. The pathogen exposure might not be equal to all fish, and the requirement here is that you proportionally sample the farm. So you can see here in this image, there are now 4 tanks. And let's assume that there are equal numbers of fish in each one. We need to test 150 fish. So we collect about 38 fish per tank, compared to a lot inspection where you would need to get 60 fish from each one. Because the pathogen exposure may not necessarily be equal, we're going to be more conservative in our estimates and assume that the pathogen prevalence is only at 2%. So that's why we have to collect more fish. Depending on the scenario, this may be a semi-annual or an annual inspection. For example, the Arkansas baitfish certification program, it's twice a year. They go out and proportionally collect 150 fish from the farm. Those are farm type inspections. So as an example, this is a little audience participation, but I can't see you. So what would you recommend here? A walleye producer that has 7 natural ponds, each stocked in the spring across 3 counties. These are very disconnected bodies of water. It could make sense for them to try to save money and try to do a farm inspection, but there's no link between these ponds, and the requirement very likely would be a lot inspection. They would go to each pond and collect 60 fish. Another example would be where a producer has 5 raceways in one shed, and there's multiple species of varying ages in those raceways. Here, they would probably want to do a farm inspection. But again, the definitions can be a little gray, can be confusing depending on who you ask and the exact scenario that's under question. So it does not hurt to consult the receiving state to confirm your approach, explain your farm setup, the types of ponds you have, and they can give some advice on the type of inspection to do. And there may be some exceptions to the rule depending on, especially as it comes to numbers. If you have high value broodfish, you may not be required to necessarily collect 60. So that's, there could be some exceptions there, and open communication is really helpful. It's important to keep in mind that biosecurity, most cases, is required to maintain your inspection status. If you have certified your pond or your facility to a certain level, you cannot import fish of lower inspection history into that facility. Basically, what happens is your whole facility then goes down to that lower status, and you have to do it all over again. It's possible to split a farm to have one part of your farm be highly inspected and controlled, and the other parts to have lower standards, and that can be done. But my experience with that has been it can make regulators and agencies a little nervous because there can be some contamination across those different zones or the different buildings at one facility. So they're going to want to have pretty clear communication on what exactly they're doing. So what pathogens to look for? This, I mentioned earlier, fish are going to be certified free of certain pathogens. And I will tell you, and I think most people who have experience with this on this webinar could attest, this is probably the biggest source of confusion and frustration when it comes to these regulatory inspections. Because what's important to one state might not necessarily be important to another, and there can be very good reason for that. And it can depend on the species in question, the purpose, the location where the fish are going. But as a starting point, when thinking about what diseases are of concern, I would recommend you look at the OIE list of certifiable pathogens. The National Aquatic Animal Health Plan has some ideas there. That isn't entirely finalized yet. Think about diseases that are, things that will be on that list are things that won't already be endemic. So for example, Collimaris is everywhere, so nobody cares about certifying fish free of Collimaris right now. Another criteria that to get on this list is that the disease, has to have the potential to cause serious impacts to farmed or wild fish populations. So this picture here is of a bluegill that could have, with these types of clinical lesions, could have a variety of diseases. In this case, it has VHS, something we would be very concerned about. What it really comes down to when defining those things in the previous slide is risk tolerance for each authority. That's going to be a big factor. Now, if there are any, this is just a few comments on what pathogens to worry about, and maybe more directed towards managers that might be on the call. I would suggest that the process for identifying pathogens of regulatory concern should be consistent and unbiased. And I would encourage states to work across boundaries to develop these requirements. I'd also encourage managers and the industry to review the scientific evidence and do risk assessments on new species or diseases of concern. You need to understand whether or not it can be introduced. If it is introduced, can it escape? And if it does escape, can it cause disease? Those are 3 steps to a risk assessment process. And oftentimes, we just jump to can it cause disease without thinking of the other 2. And we need to balance, we need to demonstrate, and I put the burden on those making policy to show that the risk of management outweighs the cost to the industry or implementing something. And as an example, we have 2 viruses here, viral hemorrhagic septicemia virus, huge concern, understandably regulated pathogen. And that's the case in most states in the country. However, we have golden shiner virus, which is probably at the other end of the spectrum, incidental finding sometimes in bait fish. And some states will deny shipment, some states don't care at all. So there are a wide range of standards when it comes to selecting pathogens of regulatory concern. And some examples for yellow perch in the Great Lakes region anyways, viral hemorrhagic septicemia is always required. Heterosporus, a microsporidium parasite, is required in probably 8 different states. Those are the only 2 things that are required as far as I know. Salmonids have a long list of pathogens, but that still can vary between different regulatory jurisdictions. Bait fish, for some states, have absolutely no requirements. Some states have several. And so that's one to look up each time you want to send stuff. And as we develop new industries, especially things like tilapia, barramundi, other exotic species that have not typically been produced here in the country. There will be new threats that come with them. And identifying pathogens of concern are an evolving process. All right, so what about when you think about barramundi or other species, or even species that have been here for a long time, the more we look and the more diagnostics we do, the more things we're going to find. Inevitably, we will find new pathogens. Just in the last 5 years or so, we have at least 15 new viruses we found in just our lab. These are usually found with non-specific diagnostic tests. Incidentally, we come across them not because they cause disease, but just because they come up in routine diagnostic inspection. We need to be very careful about how you as a producer or a manager interpret the results of a new pathogen. Interestingly, more and more states are requiring the diagnostic lab or the inspector to report all replicating viruses. And then the state decides what to do with that information. This can delay the movement of fish, oftentimes that are time sensitive. We can't hold fish, or there's for whatever reason, they need to move quickly. And delays in this process can severely impact the economic value of your production. So just be aware that this is trending to this theme, and for better or worse, that's what's going on. I will say though that although there have been a few cases where shipments have been denied because of an unknown pathogen, for the most part, there has not been major reaction since the VHS outbreaks in 2006 to 2008, when a lot of new rules were being implemented. So two things, though, to keep an eye on as it relates to fish health inspections and fish health in general. On the horizon, things that you will become familiar with if you're not already are new and re-emerging pathogens. There was once a time when producers in the United States did not have to worry about infectious salmon anemia or viral hemorrhagic septicemia or Mololaeromonas. There are new pathogens coming up. There are re-emerging pathogens, and they will no doubt present challenges in the future. Another one that relates to regulatory inspections are invasive and on-target species. Perhaps most relevant in the Great Lakes region, where there's wild-caught bait fish and broodstock, but also in production facilities in states where invasive carp are being raised or have been found in the past. There will be there are new rules and considerations being given to invasive species that producers should keep an eye on. So a few take-home messages. Fish are going to die. I think we all agreed on that on the second slide. There's inherent risk in aquaculture, and your ability to adapt and manage that risk will make or break your business. I highly encourage you to develop biosecurity plans, best management practices to mitigate those risks. I am biased on this topic, but please, I'd highly recommend prioritizing fish health. You could go a long time without ever having a problem, but when you do, it can, and it has to some people, put them out of business. So if you keep track of it over time, that'll be money and time very well spent. Regulations can be complicated, but they are meant to help. As aquaculture, as an industry, desires to move towards more of an aquatic livestock type model and work as a type of more traditional agricultural industry, this is one of those things that will come with it. There are regulations with interstate commerce. And as the industry grows, so too will the regulations to manage it. The inspection process is going to vary by jurisdiction and the species that you're producing, so become familiar with it and communicate with regulators to build trust. And for the regulatory agency people on this webinar, I'd encourage you to communicate with the aquaculture industry. Both sides knowing why and how the other is operating will go a long ways to protecting the interests of both sides. Thanks again to the sponsors of this webinar series. Looks like it'll be recorded and available at the 3 different sponsor websites, and you can see those links there.